Hey everybody, welcome back to Library Says. My name is Jamie and today I'm going to tell you about the worst 10 books I read in 2020. So of course, this is my opinion. These are books that I read in 2020. They are all books I completed. No DNFs made it onto this list. I read them start to finish and I did not enjoy them for various reasons, which I will tell you. If you did read and love these books, awesome. I'm very happy for you. I, of course, also wanted to love them, but for whatever reason, they did not work for me. All right, let's get started. I'm gonna work my way down to the very, very worst. Is gonna be number 1 at the bottom of the list, but we're gonna start with number 10. This is a book that I just read, I think like 2 weeks ago, and it is Layla by Colleen Hoover. Colleen Hoover is very hit or miss for me. I have loved some of her stuff in the past, and I have not loved some of her stuff in the past. Layla is a paranormal romance, sort of. This is a book about a couple who meet at a wedding reception, where our main character Leeds is in the band, and he meets Layla, the sister of the bride, and they hit it off immediately. And then some things happen. I'm trying not to spoil. Some things happen that upset the relationship, and there's a ghost involved. The problem with this book for me is that we rely heavily on that first meeting as a foundation for this romance, for this couple. And then we have all of these horrible things happen to the couple over the course of the book, tearing them apart. As I read it, I felt that the intention was that I was supposed to really be upset that this couple wasn't together, and all I wanted was for them to get back together at the end, have their happily ever after. And that just wasn't the case. For me, their meeting, it was sort of a, I met this manic pixie dream girl at a wedding reception, we had a lot of sex, and now we're madly in love. And I wasn't convinced. The insta-love was intense. And then by the end, when everything wraps up, I'm like, I just didn't care that much. Because of the way things roll out, I disliked Leeds for the majority of the book. And then there's a reveal, a sort of twist, like 3/4 of the way into the book, that changes everything we thought we knew about this couple, about what's happening and what has been happening, and it fixes things. And definitely I liked the end better than any other part of the book, but clearly Colleen is writing for the twist. She has an idea in her head for this crazy twist she's gonna throw in towards the end, and she writes a story to make that twist happen. And so I didn't like the rest of the book. You can't rely on just a twist. I was really frustrated by that. I can't hate a book, but then have a twist at the very end that I'm like, oh, okay, that changed everything. No, it didn't. I find that frustrating, and that is in part the issue I had last year with Verity, which also made it onto my worst of the year list. But that one was way worse. But this definitely makes the list. I was frustrated with it, and that's it. I'm moving on. Okay, number 9 on my list is Keep This to Yourself by Tom Ryan. I read this ages ago, I think like February, and it stuck with me, and not in a good way. This is a YA thriller about a group of friends who have all separated. They're all estranged because last year, one of their friend group was a victim of a serial killer. And there are a lot of secrets and a lot of bad feelings and things in this group, and we don't really know what has happened and what has driven them apart, and we're getting a little bit more. And the serial killer was never caught, so there's also that element, the whodunit. I had such high hopes for this. It's an own voices LGBTQ story and a thriller with a serial killer. I love reading about serial killers. I find it so fascinating. The unfortunate thing here is that I just didn't love the writing. I thought not a single character was well developed and fleshed out. Everyone was very flat, and I just didn't care about any of them, which is too bad because I really wanted to. And then it was so predictable. I guessed who the serial killer was early on, and then I called my friend who was not reading the book, had not read the book, and told her the basic plot of the book, and told her that I thought I had figured out who the serial killer was. And before I could even tell her my suspicion, she guessed. She wasn't even reading the book, and she also guessed who it was, who the serial killer was, without even reading the book, just based on me giving her the basic synopsis of the story. And of course, we were both right. I found that so frustrating. If you wanted it to be this excellent twist at the end, which is clearly what Tom Ryan was going for, don't make it so obvious. It's really too bad. Number 8 on my list is The Last Letter by Rebecca Yarros. This is an emotional romance. This is about a woman raising her twins alone, and her brother, who she was so close to, like the closest she was to anyone in the world, was special ops in the army and was killed overseas. The love interest in this book was a soldier who served with the brother and was given his last letter to take home to our main character. And he shows up, but doesn't give her the letter, doesn't tell her who he is. Obviously, there's problematic stuff going on there from the beginning, and so they start this relationship. If you've read or seen the movie, The Lucky One by Nicholas Sparks, it's similar vibes there. The issue I had with this is that up until the 85% mark, I was here for it. It was an emotional, well-developed, like captivating romance and familial drama, and there was such an excellent representation of grief and the life of those left behind when soldiers are deployed. And as someone whose dad was deployed in my lifetime, I really thought it was well done and believable and awesome. And then at the 85% mark, as though we have not had enough grief and loss and trauma over the course of this book, there is another death that is so blindsiding and so unnecessary. It was horrific to read. So I listened to the audiobook of this. I was actually vlogging it for Contemporary-a-thon. So I will link that up above if you want to watch my in real-time reaction to this book. Sobbing, like heaving. I was sobbing so hard. Just horrible for no reason. It was emotional manipulation of the worst kind. And it wasn't necessary is the problem. That book was good and it had enough going on. Not a fan. Not a fan. And a lot of people really love this book. If you go to Goodreads, at least on, like in my friends, 5-star after 5-star after 5-star. So I'm definitely in the minority for this, but no thank you. Just Next up is One by One by Ruth Ware. Ruth Ware and I don't get along that well. I've now read 2 of her books and I haven't liked either of them, so probably it's time for me to move on. One by One is her 2020 release and is about a group of coworkers who are going on a work trip to a ski chalet in the Alps, and they get snowed in, and it's a locked door mystery in that one after the next they start dropping dead, and it clearly has to be one of the people involved. So you're following 6 of these coworkers and 2 people who staff the chalet. It's too many people. First off, there's too many characters, and we don't get enough from each of them, so they're not well developed, so I don't care when they start dying. My only thought as they were dying was, well, thank goodness, now I have fewer people I have to remember. Also, there's just not a lot that's interesting happening here, nothing that I felt I hadn't read before, and the killer was pretty obvious from early on. I guessed who it was, probably in the first quarter of the book, and never wavered in my suspicion, and in the end was correct. So that's kind of a bummer. And then also the coworkers, the company they work for, is a music app where you can hook it up to whatever you're listening to, so it streams what you're listening to in real time, and other people can follow you, see what you're listening to, listen to it at the same time you're listening to it, which is sort of an interesting idea. And you're bouncing back and forth between the POVs of one of the coworkers. She's actually an ex-coworker. She no longer works for the company, but was invited anyway for reasons, and one of the chalet staff. So you're bouncing back and forth between these 2 women's points of view, and at the start of each of their chapters, you get their username for the app, what they're currently listening to, their subscriber count, and I kept waiting for that to matter because it was such an obnoxious and repetitive thing, and I thought, okay, this is going to play such a role later on, and I'm going to be so glad that I put up with it. No. Literally no meaning, no use, just a cheap, gimmicky thing to include that made no difference. So mostly I just was bored with this. Bored and disappointed and frustrated. And I think Ruth Ware and I are done. All right, next up is number 6 on this list, and it's Swear on This Life by Renee Carlino. A lot of people love this book. I was excited because I thought the premise was really cool. This book is about a woman who is an aspiring writer and is a creative writing professor at a university who has just not really made it. She always thought that she was an excellent writer, that she would make it as a published writer, and it really just hasn't happened for her. Then she finds out that there's a new debut novel coming out that has all this buzz, all this hype, and she hears the synopsis for this book and realizes it is her life. It is her childhood and her friendship with her best friend and how it evolved into more than a friendship, and then they were separated and haven't seen each other since. And so she suspects that the author's name is actually a pen name for this best friend who she has not seen in many years since their horrible fallout. So you are bouncing back and forth between present day and chapters of the book, and learning more and more about what happened with their relationship leading up to their estrangement and all that. Does that not sound awesome? I thought so. The writing is terrible. Like, laughably bad. We spend so much time in the flashbacks without developing present day at all, so I don't actually care about present day at all, and the characters are undeveloped, they're caricatures. They felt to me the whole time like how a teenager would write adult characters. What I would have thought a 20-something or 30-something adult's life would look like when I was 14 or 15. No concept of the complexities of adult relationships and finances and the way real jobs work and bills work and all, like, just no concept of any of that. So it felt like it was being written by a teenager who didn't really know what adults were. And so we spent so much time in the flashbacks because the writer knew how to write kids. Sort of. The whole thing just reads as corny and cliche, and we get so much build up to their reunion, and then it happens and it's nothing. And that's the point where I initially DNF'd it, which is like 60%. I DNF'd it, walked away, I was like, I'm done with this. This is so dumb. And then I was like, okay, you've read 60%. Finish it so you can write a review and give it a rating. I don't generally write fully nuanced reviews or give ratings to books that I don't finish. So I finished it. And nothing in the last 40% did anything for me that the first 60% didn't do. It's really too bad because in a different author's hands, maybe, this concept could have been really cool, but it let me down so badly. Next up, number 5 is The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. A lot of people really enjoying this one. I was super let down. It is a YA sort of mystery thriller about a girl who doesn't have a lot going for her, except that she is very smart, but she lives with her older sister, she is orphaned, she sometimes lives in her car, and then the richest man, I think in America, like a billionaire, dies and leaves her everything. For no seeming reason. She has no relation to him, has never met him, no clue. But there's a catch. She has to live in his house for 1 year, and all of his family, who he has just dispossessed, and they hate her. He also loved riddles and games, and there's all sorts of stuff going on in this mansion with these people who hate her. I was so excited. I was disappointed. I wanted there to be riddles and games and a lot going on, and there was very little of that, and what there was just wasn't very exciting or surprising. It all felt very forced. The drama's forced, and the characters are never fully developed. So there are 2 brothers who she now lives in this house with who are her love interests, her potential love interests, and they are so similar and so undeveloped that I literally could not tell them apart, could not at any point in the book tell you which one was which, what I was supposed to know about one versus the other. And then when there's all this build up to this relationship happening, I didn't care. And then it finally comes to a head and I still didn't care. It's just completely apathetic because I didn't know these characters or care about these characters. And then you get to the end and you realize that all of this was building up to nothing, and there's going to be another book, even though there's not enough plot for this to be a series. But apparently there is, and you don't get any answers, and you read this book for no reason, and I was furious. I actually buddy read this with one of my friends, and she and I had the same exact reaction to the ending of it, which was fury. If I had been reading a physical book, I would have chucked it across the room. I was listening to the audiobook, so I didn't chuck my phone across the room, but it was close. Number 4 is The Air Affair. This is the sequel to The Royal We, which I loved. I reread it this year in preparation for its sequel coming out. I was so excited, and I hated it. Hated. Like, I don't think that is too strong of a word. This book is so melodramatic, and the first one was melodramatic, but this one in such a forced soap opera-y way. The choices that are made and some of the plot points that happen in this book felt so unbelievable that even when they were presented initially, I was like, yeah, right, that is never gonna happen. Flip page, it's 3 months later, it has already happened. And I'm like, you are kidding me. I'm trying not to spoil anything, but if you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about. And my favorite character is Freddie. What is done to him in this book was infuriating. He is crapped all over. And I'm not gonna spoil it, but I hated everything about it. I hated everything about this book. I just want to pretend it never happened. And if you loved all of the characters at the end of the first book and are considering whether or not to read the sequel, I would say don't. Pretend they lived happily ever after the end, move on, and don't mess around with this sequel because it's fake. It's fake. Number 3 is Ready Player 2 by Ernest Cline. I hated this in large part because I was so disappointed because I love Ready Player 1 so much. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I have a vlog where my sister and I did nothing but listen to this audiobook over the course of a long weekend, and we hated it, and it's spoilerific. If you want to check that out, please pop up there, give it a watch, because we hold nothing back. I will just say that the direction that Ernest Cline took the characters in was not one that I thought made any sense after the end of the first book. What the book is about in the end was ludicrous. And the way he regresses on character development made me sad. All these characters that I grew to love over the course of the first book, where we leave them at the end of the first book, he destroys all of that. And I was really unhappy about it, and I still am. And I have actually, my dad really loves the first book too. We've listened to it together. The audiobook on road trips and things, he's read it multiple times, which is not something he normally does. And I told him after I read the sequel, just don't do it. I recommend you just pretend it doesn't exist. And he has decided to do that because I wish I could. I wish I could pretend I'd never read it. Number 2 on my list is The Wives by Taryn Fisher. This is a book that I initially gave 3 stars because I had a decent time during the reading experience. I thought there was a lot of thrill to this thriller. It is about a woman who is in this open sort of polygamous relationship where her husband has 2 other wives she knows about, but they don't live together, and in fact she doesn't even know their names, their identities, where they live, what they do, what their lives are like with her husband. And they're all in agreement that this situation works. But then she starts getting suspicious about the 2 wives, and she starts investigating them and stalking them. And this is such a cool idea. I just like, oh my God, what a concept for a thriller. And then the end happens, and it is such a tropey, lazy, offensive way to end this. I was flabbergasted that this is the route that she took. That a book published in 2020 could do this, would do this. So I gave it 3 stars initially, and then as time went on, I kept thinking about it and thought about all the loopholes and how forced certain things had to be and how ludicrous all the buildup was the whole time in retrospect, especially knowing what we do with the reveal at the end. I had to drop it to 2 stars because it's so bad. It's so badly written. I just watched Cindy at Read with Cindy's a video where she annihilates this book. I agree with her every thought. I'll actually link that down below so you can check it out if you haven't already. But this was one of the first books I read. Actually, I think this might have been the first book I read in 2020, and it was not a good start to the year. Okay, and number 1, the worst book I read in 2020. Also, one of the first books I read in 2020. I think it was maybe the 3rd book I read this year. It's Credence by Penelope Douglas. This is the 2nd book I have read by her, and the 2nd book that has been on my worst 10 of the year lists, 2 consecutive years. So that's not great. Maybe I should stop with Penelope Douglas. This book is about a teenage girl, I think she's 17 at the start of this book, whose parents die in a suicide pact. And she has no extended family to take her in. So they dig up this sort of non-actual family member. Her dad's stepbrother, who she's never met, who lives in a cabin with his 2 adult sons in the mountains of Colorado. And she gets shipped off. That seems believable. Okay. Then, the course of the book, you follow her as she starts a relationship with the dad, her step uncle, who is like more than twice her age, and then moves on to the younger son, has a sexual relationship with him, then moves on to the older son, has a sexual relationship with him. At some point, I think she's having relationships with multiple. There might even be some scenes where there are multiple at once. And I knew going in this was gonna be like a scandalous thing, right? Like I was very aware of what I was getting into, but it was so unbelievably written. The actual, like, I'm not saying I think it's believable that these 3 men would be like into the 17-year-old girl and totally down with sharing her, whatever. Like, yes, clearly that is not the most realistic, but the actual plotting that results in this scenario and the plot around them the whole course of the book is unbelievable. And the characters aren't great, and it's super rapey. So unfortunately, the member of this household who I think we're supposed to be rooting for her to be with and end up with, their first encounter is an all but rape scene. She is actively saying no, he is actively ignoring her, there is no communication, there is no consent, and she's physically injured in the process. And the whole time she's thinking, but he can tell that I really mean yes, which was so horrifying to me. I'm like literally at a loss. I'm at a loss. I mean, a lot of people loved this, and if you are willing to go in knowing what you're getting, knowing that it's rapey, knowing the most scandalous of scandalous setups, maybe you could love it. There was just no version of this where I could suspend my disbelief enough to be okay with some of the choices that Penelope Douglas makes in the course of this plot. Easily the worst book I read this year. For me personally. All right, that's it. Those are the worst 10 books that I read in 2020. If you read them and you agree with me, I would love to talk to you about it. If you read them and these are just like your favorite books ever, I want to talk about that too. I would be very interested to hear why you loved them so much and why you think I'm wrong. I will have my best of list video coming up really soon, and I will see you guys then. Bye.